The Birthright route of Fire Emblem Fates is known to be one of the easier entries in the series, even on Lunatic Classic difficulty. As a result, I feel as if I've never actually played or taken Birthright seriously, so to give myself some motivation to do so, I decided to make the game harder for myself with one simple change, by giving every single enemy 100% crit, while player and ally units are completely unchanged and are granted no compensation. These modifications were made by using Paragon Editor to manually flag every single enemy in the Birthright route to have forced crits. This does not change their displayed crit value in-game, but it guarantees that all enemies will always land criticals on successful hits, unless other mechanics explicitly prevent them from doing so. Since critical hits deal 3 times with damage, or 4 times with killer weapons, this means that attacks from enemies can and will one-shot the majority of your cast. Naturally, this will result in a noticeable reduction in player unit survivability. Since I have given myself no advantages to counteract this change, I will need to play the game much differently from normal. I will need to heavily prioritize avoiding counterattacks in any way possible, and use methods to avoid damage entirely, either by stacking damage reduction or by stacking avoid. If an enemy does no damage, then the crit will not do any damage, and if I dodge an attack, then the critical would also not land. But these are not trivial solutions, especially in the early game where your options are limited. Furthermore, even small amounts of chip damage can be extremely threatening when multiplied by 3, and failing to dodge even a single attack can mean instant death. Needless to say, these modifications will make the game a lot harder, but hopefully not as difficult as playing the Conqueror's route with 0 strength and magic. Since I haven't played Birthright in ages, I go into this challenge without much knowledge of how any maps will play out under these conditions. So, because of the exploratory and volatile nature of this challenge, I will not use Ironman restrictions, and I'll be making heavy use of resets to complete this playthrough. That said, I do not plan to use DLC maps or items, and I also avoid skirmish maps as well. Skirmish maps are technically a feature of the Birthright route, which allows you to freely grind against enemies for experience, but unfortunately, with my current modding tools, I do not know how to modify skirmish enemies to have 100% crit, so I think it's easier to just exclude them from the challenge entirely. With all that out of the way, let us begin. I begin by choosing Lunatic Classic difficulty, and I make a female core named Corided, which is what all my units will be whenever they are attacked. I choose a plus luck boon and minus magic bane and a priestess talent. The idea here is to boost luck to maximize miracle activations, which is one way to avoid being one-shot by a critical hit. I start my playthrough from the very beginning, before the Branch of Fate and before the Birthright route technically starts. In the prologue of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we have a premonition of the upcoming route split, where we are treated to a scripted cutscene where Xander one-shots Ryoma with a guaranteed 63 damage crit, setting the tone for how things will go for the rest of the playthrough. In Chapter 1 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we fight Xander, who has 100 crit. Xander always does enough damage to kill Corrin with a critical hit, no matter what boon or bane you pick, and his accuracy is very high. Unfortunately, he wields a bronze sword, which prevents him from landing criticals under any circumstances, which means that this run does not immediately softlock on Chapter 1. I defeat Xander to move on to Chapter 2 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, where we fight Rinka, who has 100 crit, and Kaze, who has 100 crit. In early maps, some enemies are armed with bronze or brass weapons, which prevents them from critting, and Rinka herself has a throwing weapon which has a similar restriction. The only enemy on this map that can actually make use of their bonus crit is Kaze, who is armed with an iron shuriken. What this means is that we must kill Kaze immediately, which is pretty easy because of his low defense, and I use a pair-up attack to defeat him before we can launch a lethal critical counter. The rest of the map proceeds as a normal clear would until I miss an 80% pair-up against Rinka, causing Jacob to be killed on the next turn, forcing a reset. I clear the map cleanly on the next attempt, but this death, despite not being caused by a crit, is a mere prelude to the many low probability events that will inevitably result in disaster. In Chapter 3 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we are up against a large number of samurai and archers, who all have 100 crit. Here, many enemies are armed with iron weapons instead of only bronze or brass, making this the first chapter where we really need to contend with enemy critical hits. We also get a green unit Hans, who is even more useless than he normally is, as he charges across the bridge and is immediately one-shot with a 51 damage crit. Normally, it would be possible to force their way through the top area with Corrin, but in this case, it's not even worth considering, because the crits will be too damaging. I try to sneak through the middle by activating a Dragon Vein, but it's too difficult to move through safely. I do give it a try, but all this results in is Jacob being one-shot by an archer, causing a reset. This leaves only one possibility, which is going through their bottom Dragon Vein, but activating this exposes Corrin to 3 enemies. Corrin is barely durable enough to survive 1 crit, let alone 2 or 3. so staying on the Dragon Vein tile would mean almost certain death. Luckily, Gunter has a shelter skill even in this early chapter, allowing me to activate the Dragon Vein, then shelter to move one tile away to relative safety. Gunter is lucky enough to dodge the one archer that attacks him, allowing me to kite and bait the enemy archers away from the other enemies. Unfortunately, I don't really have enough damage to defeat both of them in one round, and it's hard to do chip damage on enemy phase. Because Jacob, my only 2-range option, gets one-shot by them. But then I figure out a solution by baiting them further north to the forest, using the one extra defense to bump Jacob to just barely out of one-shot range. Jacob nearly dies eating an 18 damage critical and then counters for 8 damage, allowing me to defeat both archers on the next turn. I then move on to fight the boss, but I forget that moving into his general area triggers 3 Skyknight reinforcements from the bottom of the map. This is especially bad because I am very much out of position and they all have a 100% chance of landing critical hits. Corrin with a Gunter pair-up can get enough defense to take 0 damage from these Skyknights, but if I do that, then the enemy AI will identify Corrin as a non-target and will simply move past her to kill Jacob instead. So instead, I hide Jacob away and use Gunter with a Corrin pair, which results in less defense. The Skyknights are all lucky enough to land their 100% critical hits, transforming what would normally be insignificant chip damage into a rather scary amount. Gunter is just barely able to survive, and is able to counter and one-round each of the Skyknights with his Iron Lance. With the mobile threats handled, I decide not to mess with the rest of the enemies on this map because they're honestly just too strong and numerous to deal with, and I move to fight the boss. As it turns out, because the boss has a 100% chance of landing critical hits, Corrin's the only unit that can even fight him. Jacob gets one shot and Gunter also died from 2 15 damage criticals. The boss doubles Corrin for 2 damage a hit, which translates into 12 damage per turn, but the Shuriken debuffs massively increase this as every point of base damage from enemies converts into 3 points of crit damage. This forces me to wait out the debuff every time I'm hit so I'm not immediately killed. Luckily, the boss is stationary and doesn't heal, allowing me to take my time, so I take this opportunity to have Jacob use up his heal set for free XP and then defeat the boss to finish the map. In chapter 4 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we are up against large swarms of faceless who all have 100 crit. The objective of this map is to rout all faceless, but that is easier said than done since all of them do massive damage and you have basically no healing capability on this map. The only way to get any real amount of healing is to reach the green units Sakura and Hinoka in the upper left of the map, but I can already think of several reasons, multiplied by 3, why that isn't very easy. Luckily, we get the assistance of a green unit Ryoma. In normal playthroughs, Ryoma takes minimal damage and can easily clean most of the map on his own. However, now that all enemies have 100 crit, Ryoma's durability drastically lowers, and in my first attempt, he was crit 3 times and killed through Vantage, which under normal circumstances is nearly impossible. Naturally, this caused the attempt to fail and forced a reset. Fortunately, this was just a result of me getting particularly unlucky and Ryoma didn't get wombo comboed in future attempts. But there is still a problem because Ryoma is hardcoded to not fight the boss, and this is bad because the boss Faceless is the strongest one on the map, boasting an impressive 100 crit. Luckily, I'm able to stack some extra defense with a rank up pair up and mountain terrain, and this combined with my HP and defense level ups allows me to just barely survive the attack for the boss, hitting crit for 21 damage and going down to 1 HP. This lets me do chip damage with a Kaze attack and finish off the boss with Rinka, but that doesn't stop Corrin from dying because she missed a 77% hit on a subsequent enemy. A few more attempts also failed because poor positioning caused Kaze to get one shot, which will likely be a recurring theme because of his painfully low defense. Eventually, I'm able to get a good run going. Ryoma clears most of the map while Sakura and Hinoka are immediately critted to death. And after the map quiets down, I go up the mountain to fight the boss. I get a lucky dodge which conserves some of my healing resources, but I also miss an attack which forces me to use them anyway. Finally, I manage to defeat the boss and clean up the rest of the enemies to complete the chapter. It becomes clear to me that in this challenge, the margin of error is extremely small, and missing even one attack can have lethal consequences. In chapter 5 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we are up against a map full of dark mages and mercenaries who all have 100 crit. Here, Korra is forcibly transformed into a feral dragon, which drastically increases her stats but makes her unable to use pair-up mechanics. At the bottom of the map, Ryoma duels the boss in a fight where he luckily cannot be crit because the boss is wielding a Kadachi. However, he's basically guaranteed to lose, making him unable to assist us unless we reset a very large number of times, which is something I'd like to avoid if possible. The enemies on this map are incredibly threatening, with Wormster mercenaries being able to one-shot Korra with effective critical damage, and the Dark Mages are also no joke, because because their high magic damage is also enough to one-shot everyone, including Corrin. I begin the map by using Azura to have Corrin attack the two enemies on the right. She's able to one-shot both of them, preventing them from countering, and then move to take out the other two mercenaries on the left in a similar fashion. Around this time, Ryoma loses his duel, so he can't help us against the next group, which is a stationary formation of 2 mercenaries and 3 mages. Engaging this group is incredibly deadly because they'll one-shot any of my characters if I let them attack. I used an HP tonic that dropped from one of the mercenaries to boost Corrin's HP, and I tried to use her to bait the enemies. Unfortunately, it's not quite enough, and she's at risk of dying, but I get a lucky dodge, allowing her to survive. On the next turn, 4 reinforcement dark mages spawn from the corners, which is pretty bad because I will soon be surrounded. Unfortunately, I can't even attack into the group that I just baited because there are simply too many of them. Even if I defeat 2 with Corrin, the remaining 3 would wipe me out on the next turn. So I decided to try retreating to take out the reinforcements, but inevitably I get cornered and everyone on my team is killed by critical hits. On my next few attempts, I workshop a strategy to split up this enemy group by using Kazi and Renka as bait. Since Kazi and Renka can't really do any damage because they'll instantly die on a counter, they're better used as a way to distract enemies to split up the enemy formation so Corrin can take out smaller groups more safely. I fail quite a few times as I iterate this strategy, but I eventually figure out a good plan. I send a Kazi Renka pair up to the left to bait enemies as I put everyone else on the right. This causes 4 enemies to move to the left, and both Kazi and Renka are downed by critical hits. One of the mages, however, goes to the right, allowing me to pick him off with Corrin. As the reinforcements spawn in, I'm able to take advantage of the distance I've created to take out the 2 reinforcement dark mages on the right. Now the remaining enemies close in, so I kite them into the upper right of the map. Corrin eats a 27 damage crit, only surviving because of a fortuitous HP level up in order to take out the dark mage on the upper left, and I managed to split the remaining foes into 2 groups. I'm just barely able to heal Corrin, and I decided to take a gamble and have Corrin defeat 2 mercenaries while staying in range of enemy attack. Since Corrin dies in 2 hits while Azura and Sakura die in 1, I'm able to use both of them as bait as the dark mages will prioritize getting kills over doing damage. This alone wouldn't be enough, but I get very lucky as one of the mages misses when attacking Sakura. Sakura dies to a crit on the next attack, but this leaves me with a full HP Corrin and an alive Azura. I have Corrin take out 2 of the 3 remaining mages, and Azura dies to a crit on the next turn, allowing me to clean up the last mage with Corrin. This leaves only the boss, who is a feeble and pathetic enemy who cannot even land critical hits, which is a deficiency that dooms him to a swift death by Corrin's hand. Now we enter the Branch of Fate, which allows us to finally enter the Birthright route. I decide to change my Corrin build. Instead of using a Priestess talent, I decide to change a Mercenary, which is difficult to get in Birthright. I figured that if I want Miracle, I could probably get it from a Sakura A support instead, and with the Mercenary class line, I could possibly get valuable breaker skills like Axe Breaker and Shuriken Breaker. I then enter Chapter 6 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, where Corrin decides to turn on Nora and side with Hoshido, starting a fight against Xander, who has 100 crit. This map has a lot of units, but the objective is simply to defeat Xander, which you can do with only Ryoma. Normally this chapter can be completed very quickly, and your other units won't even have to do anything. So I attack Xander with Ryoma, whose Duelist Blow skill drops Xander's hit rate to 20%, but despite this low accuracy, Xander managed to one-shot Ryoma with a critical hit. Since nobody else in my armor can handle Xander, this quickly leads to a game over. On the next attempt, I have Ryoma attack from the forest, boosting his avoid, which helps him dodge Xander's counter attack. But then on enemy phase, a Cavalier moves in and crits Ryoma for 30 damage. Afterwards, Xander parap attacks for another 30 damage crit, which kills Ryoma again. On attempt number 3, I attack from the forest again, and this time Xander immediately counters with a 10% accuracy critical hit that instantly annihilates Ryoma for the 3rd time in a row. On the 4th attempt, I try something different. I attack again for the forest, and then choose to bait Xander's higher accuracy enemy fates attack by sacrificing the younger siblings Takumi and Hanoka. But this doesn't work out because he just retreats to get healed by Elise and then one-shots Ryoma again anyway. On attempt 5, Xander lands another 10% hit, which once again, for the 5th time in a row, insta-kills Ryoma from full HP. At this point, the sheer amount of ridiculous bad luck I've gotten makes me start to think that I messed up somehow when making the edits for this chapter. But finally, on attempt 6, Ryoma does not instantly die on turn 1 and deals considerable damage to Xander. On the next turn, a Cavalier moves in and this time misses his attack, while Xander's parap attack crits Ryoma for 30 damage, which fortunately is not lethal. Xander retreats to get healed by Elise and Leo moves into attack, only for Ryoma to defeat him with a vantage crit. I pursue Xander on the next turn, but unfortunately, Elise's personal skill, Lily's Poise, boosts Xander's defense enough to survive combat, which drags the fight on and puts Ryoma at greater risk of being killed by a critical hit. While this is happening, all the rest of the units start attacking my main army, and I have to desperately run away to survive. Xander is healed again by Elise and attacks attacks Ryoma again, but this time I'm lucky enough that he misses, allowing me to finish him off on the next turn, completing the chapter. And I think the main lesson we can learn from this chapter is that dodge tanking will probably not be very good in this challenge. In chapter 7 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we encounter a rare negative difficulty spike. Enemy strength drops considerably the moment we start playing Birthright exclusive chapters, and we simultaneously gain many ways to enhance our defenses and offenses. I equip Corrin with a Dragonstone, give her a Rinka backpack, and use a defense tonic, which boosts her defense to the point where none of the enemies on this map can damage her at all. Even if they have 100 crit, they will still do 0 damage. Unlike in the Conquest route, where enemies will refuse to attack if they do no damage, in Birthright, enemies will gleefully sacrifice their lives to launch attacks that do nothing to you. This route-based AI downgrade will go a long way to making this challenge more reasonable. However, even though Corrin is invincible, nobody else is, and pretty much all my other units will get one shot if they are struck by a critical hit, which greatly limits my tactical options. Fortunately, this map has many stationary enemies as well as several one-tile choke points that can be exploited to ensure that Corrin is the only one that faces attacks. I move Corrin forward and have her defeat enemies while taking 0 damage until I decide to try training my other units. I try to feed some XP to Kaze, but he misses 2 out of 4 72% hits against a stationary enemy, which results in him dying from a critical hit on enemy phase. Despite Kaze being the explicit reason to reset, I find that I've also moved too slowly on this map to obtain the treasure, which is an armor slayer from the middle of the map, which is otherwise not obtainable in the Birthright route. So I reset, and on the next attempt, Kaze dies again because I accidentally attacked an axe fighter from one range, and then on the next attempt, he dies again because he missed an attack and got crit on the counter. On the next attempt, I managed to clear much of the map without accidentally getting Kaze killed, but I still move too slowly to obtain the armor slayer, so I try again. This time, I move as aggressively as I can. I move Corrin farther forward and do my best to ensure that Corrin fights as many enemies as possible on enemy phase, allowing me to clean up wounded enemies with my other characters. Once I make it into the open area, I move Corrin down to block Silas and the Cavaliers to the left, who deal basically no damage to Corrin, even though they have 100 crit. By doing this, I'm able to cut off the retreating thief and take him out to get the armor slayer, which honestly will not even be that useful in future chapters. In chapter 8 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we are up against Fuga and the Wind Tribe, who all have 100 crit. By this map, we were given an absolute crapload of characters, which is pretty abnormal this early in a Fire Emblem game. We have 14 characters in total for this map, and predictably, most of them are really bad. Discussing each of these characters individually will be laborious and also highly repetitive because they all have the same problem. They are low level and have poor weapon ranks. In a normal playthrough, this can be fixed by training them, but in this challenge, basically all of these problems are nearly impossible to rectify because training low level characters is extremely difficult because of the 3x damage multiplier from enemy critical hits. As a general rule, it's hard to train units that die in one hit. Of the units that we do have, the glaring exceptions are Sakura, Jacob, and Hinoka. Sakura and Jacob give valuable damage reduction auras, which have heightened importance in this challenge because damage reduction applies before the critical multiplier. Hinoka is great because she is incredibly tanky in early chapters, due in part to the guard Naginata that she joins with, that drastically boosts her defense and resistance to the point where she just doesn't take damage on this map. Corrin and Azura are good for the same reasons that they're always good, but everyone else kinda suffers from dying in one-hit itis, which relegates them to use as backpacks or two-range ship damage options. This map is structured as a mostly flat area with restricted desert movement. A few enemies will move at the start of the map, but for the most part, the enemies are largely stationary and can be picked off individually. I decide not to overcomplicate things and just have Corrin and Hinoka clear most of the map, because they can do it safely without instantly dying from critical hits. I take a quick detour to recruit Mozu from her Paralog chapter, which goes pretty smoothly with 2 flying units, and then move on to chapter 9 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit. The map starts off with everyone in a small room surrounded by mages and archers who all have 100 crit. This is probably one of the roughest early Birthright chapters, and for good reason. Your units are all very vulnerable in the starting room because they're exposed to attack from all directions. This is made worse in this challenge because a good chunk of my army will take lethal damage from any attack. The mix of enemy damage types makes this even more precarious. Corrin's resistance, even with the Dragonstone, is not very good, so she will have a hard time resisting magical crits, and Hinoka does very poorly against critical effective bow damage. My first approach for this map is to layer defensive buffs to try to use the room's entrance as a choke point, but I find it difficult to find space for all my weaker characters. So I try to push out with Hinoka, but I miss several attacks, which causes my strategy to fall apart completely as people get killed by critical hits. On the next attempts, I make sure to under-deploy and use fewer characters than the deployment limit to reduce the initial vulnerability inside the starting room, but I quickly find myself overwhelmed by the sheer amount of magical damage, which adds up to result in Korin's death. On the next attempt, I manage to snipe the enemy archers near the entrance, allowing Hinoka to move out more safely. With a guard Naginata and a Renka pair-up, she's able to successfully tank both physical and magical damage as long as she doesn't get hit by a bow. With 2 solid units out front, I'm able to split up the magical attackers, which helps Korin survive. Regrettably, I do have to give up the treasure, which includes a speed wing and some gold, because I cannot move fast enough to claim it, and I also move too slowly to recruit Oboro and Hinata, who start as green units in the lower left. While I still have my hands full with other enemies, they are cornered and killed by critical hits. I consider resetting to try to recruit them, but I conclude, after careful consideration, that I don't care enough to do so. The rest of the map proceeds with a more relaxed pace because the enemy reinforcements come in more manageable quantities. I use the many stationary enemies on the map to feed XP into weaker characters like Setsuna and Mozu, and then move on to the boss Zola, who has a Mjolnir tome that can do guaranteed 4x critical damage. Luckily, Hinoka has so much resistance that she can fight him while taking no damage at all. In the closing cutscene, Leo attempts to kill Zola with a critical hit, but Korin intervenes because we need him for a stupid and unsatisfying plotline to fill airtime for the next few chapters. In chapter 10 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we are up against a forest of ninjas who all have 100 crit. Early on in this map, we get Takumi, who is obscenely powerful as he is tailor-made to one-shot ninjas on this chapter, which lets him fight without suffering critical hit counterattacks. This is a great help because ninjas are quite troublesome to deal with because of their 1-2 range and defense debuffs, which are effectively 3 times stronger because enemies will always crit. This map features terrain that can damage your units, but the main challenge for us is the highly overlapping ranges of enemy reinforcements. This makes it very unsafe to attack enemy forces because anyone that you send will be in the threat range of the next wave. In my initial attempts, I play too passively and get overwhelmed as the enemies stack up, so I reset to try again. On later attempts, I move more aggressively to get on top of the reinforcements to defeat them at their spawn point, which allows me to take them out more safely. In the middle of handling reinforcement waves, as I move forward, I try to make a smart play by passing around Hinoka's guard Naginata to help Tsubaki tank some hits, but I was lacking the critical information that he fucking sucks and doesn't even have enough weapon rank to use it, which denies him the defense bonus, and he dies after being hit by 3 consecutive criticals. I consider resetting, but I figured that I won't be using his loser ass anyway, so I just leave him dead. I continue and manage to grind through the reinforcements, defeating Kotro to complete the map. In chapter 11 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we face a surprisingly challenging map against an absolutely massive number of flying enemies who all have 100 crit. We get Reina on this map, who is a great help because of her flying movement and bow access. I also decided to bring as many archers as possible, including Setsuna, Takumi, and a reclassed Mozu, because every single enemy on this map is a flying unit. In my initial attempt, I decided to move upwards and activate the Dragon Vein, which creates a protective whirlwind that greatly impedes the movement of all flying units. This makes it very difficult for the enemies to approach and allows me to defeat them relatively safely. This map has a mix of enemy AI behavior. There are reinforcements that are immediately aggressive as well as quite a few enemies that are stationary on the map. By camping near the starting area, I'm able to take out the reinforcement flyers quite handily, but once the reinforcements stop, every single stationary enemy on the map becomes aggressive and they rush you all at once. I try to hide inside a whirlwind, but I'm quickly surrounded and overwhelmed as more than 2 dozen enemy flyers barrel in and kill pretty much everyone with critical hits. After trying a few more times, I come to the conclusion that the winning strategy should be to move as aggressively as I can to reduce the enemy count so that the enemies will not overwhelm me when they all become aggressive. I start by having Reina move down immediately to take out an enemy flyer and quickly withdraw her after she sustains a crit. I have my archers sit just outside of enemy range, which is impeded by the Dragon Vein effect, allowing me to one-shot them as they move in. I leave my archers in place to ward off the reinforcement flyers as the rest of my army moves farther to the left to bait the stationary enemies with high defense units like Korin and Hinoka. As the reinforcements start spawning from the middle of the map, I move my archers to keep pace. I manage to move much more quickly than before and successfully bait a much larger proportion of stationary enemies than in previous attempts. I even managed to get all the way to the left Dragon Vein, which produces a much more favorable staging ground for defense because the whirlwind reaches all the way to the left edge of the map. This, combined with a conveniently placed structure to the right, makes it much more difficult for enemies to surround me. I'm able to use my archers and archer pair-up attacks to continuously defeat enemy flyers, and I also use my flyers to preemptively take out troublesome enemies, such as a Malignant with a Mjolnir tome. This time, once the remaining stationary enemies become aggressive, I am prepared. All of the enemies at the bottom of the map have already been cleared, and around half the remaining remainder are effectively neutralized by the terrain. They are hopelessly stuck between the whirlwind and the edge of the map. This allows me to fight the remaining enemies in a more piecemeal fashion, allowing me to safely route them and complete the chapter. In Chapter 12 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we play an escape map that's extremely forgettable because you can easily complete it in one turn without doing any combat. The objective here is to get Corrin to the escape point at the top of the map, which you can easily accomplish just by pairing Corrin with a flying unit. However, this is also the first map that features particularly useful capturable units, so I decide not to escape immediately. Of particular note are capturable Great Knights that have a ton of defense and maxed weapon ranks. These are particularly rare features for a unit in the Birthright route, since most units have bad weapon ranks and relatively low defense. I open the map by moving downwards with Corrin to tank the initial enemies with their Dragonstone. One of the close by enemies is a Great Knight with a droppable hammer, which is convenient because I can do chip damage to him and capture him easily, even with a significantly underleveled Orochi. With the Great Knight secured, I then move to get the Draco Shield from the center of the map. Unfortunately, throughout the map, an incredibly powerful Xander moves in from the upper left, and I end up getting caught as he one-shots Reyna with a 111 damage crit, forcing a reset. On the next attempt, things go a lot smoother as I move more quickly so I have more time to get away from Xander. After capturing the Great Knight and grabbing the Draco Shield, I quickly use pair-up chains to move Corrin to the escape point, completing the map. I then go to the prison where I manage to buy the loyalty of the captured Great Knight by using assorted My Castle resources. Nohrian law is blunt on the subject of traitors. You must switch sides if the enemy gives you 8 beans and 6 fish. In Chapter 13 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we are up against increasingly powerful enemies that all have 100 crit. On this map, there are multiple houses that we can visit for loot, but more importantly, there are many powerful promoted enemies that can do devastating amounts of damage with critical hits. I use Wolfgang, the Great Knight that I captured last chapter, to great effect because he has 22 base defense, which becomes 29 defense with a rank up pair up and the guard Naginata. This is vastly higher defense than any other unit that I currently have, and it lets him solo a tremendous number of enemies, while I use the rest of my army to secure treasure from the houses. I use a Dragonbait to drop Hans down to 1 HP, and then take him out along with the rest of the enemies on the bottom of the map, and then move on to fight the stationary enemies at the top of the map by baiting them on an individual basis, and by doing this I managed to capture a Wyvern Knight, another excellent high defense generic. Pretty much any promoted generic that I capture can be easily slotted into my army because so many of my actual units are under leveled and have poor weapon rank because it's been nearly impossible to train them effectively. I use Hinoka to bait out the boss, Camilla, and Hinoka's extremely high resistance renders her impervious to Camilla's attacks. But once the boss is defeated, all the remaining foes move all at once, which ends up being pretty dangerous. I get put into a pretty sticky situation where a general could one-shot Corrin with a critical hit, but I find I'm able to exploit the enemy AI to get out of this potential game over scenario. The enemy, despite having their guaranteed crit flags enabled, do not actually know that they will always get a critical hit, and so their AI actually prioritizes avoiding counterattacks. Instead of choosing to vaporize Corrin with a critical hit, an enemy general instead uses his javelin to avoid a counterattack, which lets me just barely survive enemy phase. This AI quirk, unique to this challenge, lets me buy some time for Wolfgang to swing around and whack the general with the Chapter 12 hammer, something that only he can do because he's the only unit with enough axe rank. I use this opportunity to capture this general and then clean up the rest of the enemies to complete the chapter. The loyalty of these newly captured generics is bought with a week's worth of groceries, which is a cheap price considering that in this challenge, they are just better than most actual Birthright units that you get up until this point. In Chapter 14 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we are up against multiple squads of cavalry on a flat plane who all have 100 crit. For this map, we get Ryoma and Scarlet, who are both extremely powerful characters. More importantly, this is the chapter where we can upgrade our armory and get some of Birthright's absolutely ridiculous weaponry, such as the Pike Rune Club, Sword Catcher, and Axe Splitter. These weapons deal effective damage if they have weapon triangle advantage, which is an extremely easy condition to achieve. The map begins on an open field against massive numbers of enemy cavalry, and I think I probably overestimated the difficulty of this map going in. Under normal circumstances, using Birthright units, this could be scary because the enemies can actually damage you, but my newly recruited generics barely take any damage to begin with, especially with defense pair-ups and a guard Naginata. I send Wolfgang down the center and he's able to kill a terrifying number of enemies as I have everyone else move up the left side, where standout characters like Ryoma, the generic Wyvern Knight Liam, and the generic General Roland are more than enough to clean up the remaining enemies. I take out the stationary enemies guarding the castle, and all the enemies inside are easily lured one by one and defeated for XP. I find it a little strange that the units that I captured are so vastly superior to their Nohrian brethren, and I conclude that this discrepancy is probably because the average Nohrian is incredibly malnourished and only knows of the plural form of calorie in a hypothetical sense. At this point in the game, Birthright enters a period of extreme enemy stat stagnation. Enemies don't get much stronger while your units quickly grow to outscale them. In a typical playthrough, these maps are extremely easy, but when all enemies have 100 crit, they're all still extremely easy. As such, I will discuss the next 7 maps more quickly than other chapters. In chapter 15 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we fight 59 Wolfskin who all have 100 crit. That said, while the enemies sometimes have some skills, none of this variety actually matters since they can't do any damage to my units. I just arm Wolfgang the Great Knight with a Beast Killer and have him slaughter the entire Wolfgang to complete the map. In chapter 16 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we fight inside a palace against enemies with 100 crit. There's a pretty nasty group of promoted units near the start of the map. Sorcerers especially are quite scary and can one-shot my generals with critical hits, but more importantly, they are hidden behind locked doors, so I can't get rid of them before they attack. After a decent number of failed attempts, I figure out a strat where I use some advanced movement techs to kill the enemy thieves and block the doors, preventing the strong enemies from getting out of their rooms. However, after this initial challenge, the rest of the map is easily handled by slow attrition. Near the end of the map, I capture another general named Hubert, whose undying fealty is bought and paid for with 15 fish and 11 daikon radishes, which is a steep price, but worth it for such a fine soldier. In chapter 17 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we move to subjugate the Ice Tribe, who all have 100 crit. If you really want to, you can just move across the map to defeat Flora to complete the map immediately, but if you want the treasure, you'll need to visit the houses. Instead of getting loot, you instead spawn an enemy ambush of soldiers that drop loot, which is pretty much the same thing, but you also get XP. I clear the entire map and have Roland delete Flora with a 54 damage crit. In chapter 18 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we fight Leo, his retainers, and 84 summoned faceless, who all have 100 crit. This map can also be pretty easily completed in 1 or 2 turns by attacking Leo, but I decided to play it the long way to see how it goes. I find that fighting all the faceless is mostly just tedious because they are all incredibly weak, having only around 20 attack each. Since they can't even damage most of my characters, I just form a big wall with all my generic units and repeatedly spam end turn, letting me clear them in massive quantities. Eventually, Leo and his retainers move in, and Leo one-shots Liam, the generic Wyvern Knight, with an off-screen critical hit, but I'm honestly not even fazed at the loss. I'm not willing to reset and play the whole map all over again, so I just immediately take out Odin, Niles, and Leo to get the loot and complete the chapter. In chapter 19 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we fight a bunch of weird enemies with fucked up stats such as generals with 0 defense. But aside from this gimmick, this map isn't very interesting, especially since none of these weird units are capturable. In chapter 20 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we face another map full of faceless inside the stomach of a dead dragon. Even though these faceless all have 100 crit, since all of them have pathetic attack, this map is trivial to clear if you have at least one unit with high defense. We then finally move on to chapter 21 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, which is a lava map with many Stoneborn who have 100 crit. I was pretty nervous going into this map because I was afraid that the Stoneborn could one-shot my characters from a long range with critical hits, but as it turns out, my concern was unwarranted. Stoneborn in the Birthright route are much weaker than they are in Conquest, and furthermore, all Stoneborn weapons have a hidden flag that prevents them from landing criticals, making this map pretty much just as easy as it would be in a normal Birthright run. There is a gimmick though, where to progress by a land route, you have to pick between 2 dragon veins. The correct vein creates a land route to the next area, but the incorrect one turns the floor into lava and makes you fight 5 turns of reinforcements before creating the path. I pick incorrectly once out of 3 times, but all it really does is slightly slow me down. Once I get past all 3 dragon veins, I just send a pair of the generic generals Roland and Hubert forward, and with their massive defenses, they were able to wade past an entire army to kill the boss and complete the map. With 7 more or less free maps out of the way, we finally exit the easy middle stretch of Birthright and enter the endgame, where increased enemy scalings can hopefully provide an interesting challenge. In chapter 22 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we enter the capital where Norians have slightly better access to food. We are immediately ambushed by Shura and his tiny 63-member bandit group, who all have 100 crit. After consuming a hearty feast of ice soup and a single lentil, these bandits are more nourished and much stronger than any Norian we faced up until this point. These enemies are tough and there's a lot of them. The enemy composition mainly consists of axe fighters and mages. The berserkers are quite easy to handle because of their low defense, but the mages get quite tricky to deal with because their massive magical damage can kill most of my characters in one shot. I deal with the berserkers mainly by attacking them from 2 range and focus on either one-shotting the sorcerers with pair-up attacks or attacking them with high resistance units like Kaze or Hanoka. As I cleared the map, I soon realized that Birthright row enemies tend to have really low accuracy for some reason. Dodge tanking wasn't very reliable early in the game, but the situation has changed since then, so I decided to experiment and just throw Ryoma at the last group of 24 promoted enemies, and surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, he dodges every attack and just kills everything. In chapter 23 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we are up against Camilla and around 70 cavalry cavalry and wyverns who all have 100 crit. Compared to previous chapters, this is a big increase in difficulty because of the boost in enemy power and aggression as well as the map gimmick. This map is organized into 3 wide columns, and every turn Camilla will activate a Dragon Vein that deals 10 damage to all player units in one of those columns. This is always targeted towards the column with the most player units, and it also destroys terrain, permanently making the space more open. Units in the corridors between columns can avoid the AoE damage, but the space is quite cramped. Enemy composition is mainly focused on high movement fighters and cavalry, with a mix of magical and physical damage. However, most of these enemies also have surprisingly low accuracy, leading me to believe that I can use Ryoma to dodge tank them. Unfortunately, Ryoma can't cover every enemy that approaches, and I end up getting hit from 2 angles. In my first few attempts, I take losses on the non-Ryoma front, forcing resets. Ryoma himself does quite well, as he's able to dodge quite consistently and also survive being crit, with shield gauge and vantage activations further extending his survivability. But the enduring problem is that I'm not really able to protect the rest of my army from an aggressive wave of enemies on the right. It takes a few attempts, but I work out a plan where Ryoma handles the majority of the enemies on the left side while the rest of my army moves forward to deal with the other threats proactively. On the right side, I move as far forward as I can, making sure to snipe the enemy flyers and taking advantage of the terrain to block enemy movement. Eventually, I manage to stabilize the right side, but the other part of the plan fails. After dodge tanking and vantage sweeping a tremendous number of enemies, Ryoma's luck finally runs out and he gets killed by a crit. I make several more attempts in the hopes of just brute forcing things, but Ryoma keeps getting crit and keeps getting killed. With this in mind, I decide to optimize Ryoma further to increase his avoid. I buy him stat boosters with the tremendous amount of gold that Birthright just hands you, and I also reclass Rinka into a Swordmaster, which gives Ryoma a lot of speed from the pair up. By combining all of this along with tonics, meals, and rally speed and luck from Hanoka and Sakura, I'm able to stack a ridiculous 110 avoid on Ryoma, which is actually more avoid than many of the enemies on this map have hit rate. Ryoma had trouble surviving when enemies had around 10 to 20% hit rate, but now chance is no longer a factor, because many of the enemies now literally have 0 hit against him. In other words, for this map, Ryoma has become invincible, and with this, the rest of the chapter is no longer an obstacle. He's able to sweep through most of the enemies by himself with no difficulty. As I complete the chapter, I also managed to capture and recruit the Grey Knight Tobias and the Wyvern Lord Leonard to fill out my ranks for the endgame. In chapter 24 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we were up against Hans and a grand total of more than 130 enemies including reinforcements, who all have 100 crit. Fortunately, this is a defeat boss map and not a route map because that is a very large number of enemies. I try opening the map with a low effort strategy by undeploying everybody and just sending Ryoma ahead, but he's immediately killed in one shot by a critical hit, which tells me that this strategy probably won't be very reliable. Chapter 23 was easily steamrolled with just Ryoma, but in chapter 24, enemies are already a lot stronger. They have 10 to 20% more accuracy, which combined with weapon triangle advantage and increased damage, means that Ryoma will almost inevitably get one shot and killed if I try soloing the map with him. Fighting all of the enemies on this map probably isn't very viable, just because of the sheer number of enemies that there are. The map is extremely open, featuring enemy reinforcements from all directions, which include a ton of flying units, so hunkering down really isn't an option. The best strategy here is probably to rush down the boss as quickly as possible. Luckily, by this point in the Birthright route, you have access to a total of 4 rescue staffs, which you can use to teleport units straight to the boss and defeat him. So I decided to bring all 4 rescue staffs and then get to work. On turn 1, I immediately have Felicia rescue Korn forward so Korn can attack a Great Knight that blocks the way to Hans, and she's able to get the kill with the Armor Slayer from chapter 7, and then rescue Ryoma forward, but he's not quite able to reach the boss. I use my 3rd rescue staff to move my 4th rescue staff user forward, letting me use another rescue to teleport Azura ahead. Azura dances for Ryoma, giving him enough movement to attack Hans and immediately defeat him with a critical hit, completing the map in only 1 turn. In chapter 25 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we fight Iago in an extremely large area with way too many enemies that all have 100 crit. The map begins with an army adjacent to a couple of foes, with large groups of cavalry to the left and the right. My generic units were able to make short work of the nearby generals with a hammer, surviving enemy critical hit counterattacks with their high HP and defense. I managed to break through the center, but I find that defending against the flanking cavaliers is quite difficult due to their extreme quantity. I try sending Ryoma to the right to handle them, but I find that the strategy has very low reliability. This is made worse by the fact that extremely large numbers of reinforcements also come from the sides for the first few turns, meaning that standing and fighting is probably not very viable. So instead, just like the last chapter, I decided to try to rush down Iago to complete the defeat boss objective, but Iago is extremely far away, making him very difficult to reach quickly. I do notice, however, that the map has quite a few trap staff users. Enemy and trap staffs are usually used to teleport player units into a deadly ambush, but I figure I can probably use this extra movement to my advantage. So, on a subsequent attempt, I defeat the generals and send Ryoma forward. Ryoma is entrapped by an enemy strategist and is attacked by 3 berserkers, and he easily defeats them with the help of weapon triangle advantage. After being entrapped, Ryoma has been moved much closer to the boss, potentially putting Iago into range within the next few turns. Pretty much everyone else in my army gets killed because I wasn't paying attention, but I decided to keep running Ryoma upwards to see what he can do. Iago is surrounded by a very large number of powerful units, making him difficult to access, but Ryoma is able to kill quite a few of his guards. And he even managed to get in range to fight Iago, but he sadly dies due to a low accuracy 99 damage crit. Since I almost managed to defeat the boss, I decided to keep going with this concept. This time, I move everyone up as quickly as I can, avoiding attacks from all the cavalry from the lower left and right. But this time, once Ryoma reaches Iago's guards, he is swarmed and killed, as he was unable to dodge all of their attacks. I continue attempting this strategy, but every time Ryoma just keeps getting killed, as he is unable to dodge the enemies consistently enough to survive. So I go back to the drawing board and I realize that after the first entrap, the central chamber is largely undefended, meaning that I could probably move other characters to assist Ryoma. So on the next attempt, I move Hinoka farther in with an Azura dance to get her near Ryoma after he is entrapped. As I do this, I accidentally get Orochi killed on enemy phase, but it's fine because she probably doesn't have much more use in this playthrough. I have Ryoma bait a few enemies to expose Iago to an attack from 2 range, but he's still too far to reach him in 1 turn. I could try to inch closer, but then Ryoma will just be attacked by all the guards and probably die from being swarmed. This is where Hinoka comes in. As a Falcon Knight, she can use staves, so I move her forward and use Rescue to give Ryoma an extra few tiles of movement, allowing him to move into the gap I just made to attack and defeat Iago, completing the map in only 3 turns. In chapter 26 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we face Xander, who has 100 crit, which is sadly not accurately reflected in the cutscene where he fights Corrin. Instead of instantly decapitating Corrin with a critical hit, Xander and Corrin exchange blows for a surprisingly long time before Elise interrupts and Xander cuts her in half with a 117 damage crit. With this, the map begins. Unfortunately, this map is a joke, but it's not haha funny. It's honestly just kind of sad. Here, Corrin and Xander duel in a central chamber. Xander will wait patiently for his revenge, but only for 8 turns. This is plenty of time, because you only need a single turn to beat this chapter. Your army is deployed extremely close to Xander, and the path to him is protected by only a single general and a single locked door, neither of which are particularly notable. Unlike the Ryoma map in the Conquest route, this door can just be opened without needing to defeat mini-bosses or satisfy any other special requirements. As a result, the 40-something other enemies on this map can be ignored completely, and they don't even have special loot or anything. Xander is abnormally weak on this map because he's upset that he accidentally bisected the wrong sister with his magical sword, but he's still able to kill Corrin with 1 critical hit. So I begin the map by having a generic Wyvern Knight defeat the single blocking general with a hammer, and then have Kaze lockpick the door. I then have Ryoma attack Xander to soften him up and finish him off with Corrin, completing the sorry excuse for a map but the only way that it can be completed, trivially and anticlimactically. In chapter 27 of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we face King Garen, who has 100 crit. There are a lot of enemies on this map, and since our units start a great distance away from the boss, warp skipping it is not very viable. The only real option we have is to fight through all the enemies as best we can. To prepare for this map, I take a detour to play the Midori Paralog. Paralog scaling makes the enemies very high level, making it very easy to gain experience. I reclass Ryoma into a blacksmith by using a Rinka S support, so I can get Lancebreaker, which grants plus 50 avoid when facing enemy lances, patching up one of Ryoma's few weaknesses. I then reclass Ryoma back into Swordmaster for the passive avoid buff and tackle chapter 27. The first few attempts go poorly as the map is quite open and enemies quickly become aggressive, making it difficult to protect the rest of my army. But after a few tries, I work out a general plan. I immediately move Ryoma as forward and as aggressively as I can to ensure that as many enemies as possible attack him on enemy phase, and I shuffle all other units away from enemy range. Ryoma manages to avoid every attack and handily defeats generals, berserkers, and great knights with his new Lancebreaker skill. On the right side, I use Corrin to bait out a batch of heroes, and she nearly dies from exposing herself to too many attacks by unexpectedly killing an enemy with Dragon Fang. But this unluckiness is balanced out as she is saved by a miracle activation. The next wave of enemies are 8 Bull Knights that move in from the side chambers. I have everyone move up to defeat the 4 on the right, and I move out of range with the remaining Bull Knights so I can deal with them on the next turn. This This gives me enough breathing room to hide the rest of my forces away, so I now have the luxury of sending Ryoma alone to handle the rest of the map. I get jump scared when a Swordbreaker Brave Axe Berserker double vengeances Ryoma, but he managed to survive the hit and just clears all the Berserkers in the middle and the Wyverns to the left. This leaves only a pack of Dark Knights to the right, and I use Ryoma to block and defeat them. Unfortunately, Ryoma gets hit by an entrap staff, moving him out of the way, allowing the Dark Knights to move in and kill Sakura and Felicia, who are my only staff users with any amount of staff rank. At this point, I have cleared the map and have essentially completed it. Defeating Garen at this point would be trivial as he has 0 hit against Ryoma and Korin, but the loss of my staff users compromises my strategy for the final chapter. Since I didn't want to reset or replay the map again, I decided to fix this by using all my remaining heal staffs in the convoy to grind up staff rank in the second to last chapter of the game. So I give Hinoka all of my staffs and then get to work, and defeat all the enemies around Garen and then aim to use Garen as a means of damaging my characters so I can heal them for staff rank. However, since Garen has extremely high physical damage as well as 100 crit, most characters are not suitable for this as they will just die, so I turn to my generics. A general pair up with a guard Naginata gets a crazy amount of defense, more than enough to comfortably survive Garen's attacks. I let Garen continually attack my general so that Hinoka can repeatedly heal him for staff rank. After around 15 minutes, I nearly run out of staffs, but have just barely enough for Hinoka to go all the way from E rank staffs to a staff rank of B, which is sufficient for my endgame strategy. After completing this grind, I then decide to end the map. I have Korin attack and then finish Garen off with Ryoma, bringing us to the final chapter of the Birthright route. In the final chapter of Birthright against enemies with 100 crit, we face Garen's Draconic 4, which has 100 crit. That said, this is perhaps one of the most cheesable final maps and bosses in the entire Fire Emblem series, because our army is deployed extremely close to the boss. In this challenge, things become a bit more difficult because Garen has a massive attack stat and can probably one-shot anyone with a critical hit. Garen has 80 HP and Dragon Skin, which halves all damage taken, meaning that defeating him will take quite a bit of effort. But one notable weakness of Blight Dragon Garen is that he is not immune to status effects, and in the Birthright route, we have access to the Hexing Rod, which lets us cut his HP in half. Hexing Rod accuracy isn't amazing, but we do have access to a total of 3 staffs and 9 uses, so we can just keep trying until it works. Since I lost all my staff users last chapter, I currently only have Hinoka with enough staff rank to use the Hexing Rod. I open the map by immediately having Hinoka try using the Hexing Rod, but I miss, so I try again by having Jacob use Shelter, and then with a transfer swap, I have Hinoka use another Hexing Rod, and it hits, cutting Garen's HP in half and dropping him down to 40 HP. With this in place, I send Wolf King up to attack an enemy general that's in the way with a hammer, and I finish the job with Tobias. This clears the way to Garen, and I start by having Ryoma attack. Ryoma does 12 damage, then is completely and utterly annihilated by a 99 damage crit retaliation. Korin can't quite do enough damage to finish the job, so I use Rescue to move Midori up in a sacrificial play to deal some chip damage and apply debuffs, but she manages to survive a 123 damage crit with a miracle activation. With this debuff in place, Korin has exactly enough damage to defeat Garen, so I move to attack and defeat Garen on my first attempt, completing my challenge run of the Birthright route against enemies that all have 100 crit, using a total of only 58 resets. This concludes my playthrough of Fire Emblem Fates Birthright on Lunatic difficulty against enemies with 100 crit. In the closing cutscene, Azura trips to the carpet and the ground kills her with a critical hit. Overall, it was a rather interesting if relatively brief challenge compared to others I've done, taking 6 streams and around 25 hours of playtime. Guaranteed enemy crits really heightened lethality throughout the game, which made things pretty rough for most characters. I feel that some amount of danger existed throughout most of the game, because as it turns out, critical hits do a lot of damage. A lot of the difficulty of the run was concentrated in the early parts of Birthright, when options are generally quite limited. The mid-game was pretty easy because low enemy scaling meant that nothing was much of a threat. Things picked up again in the endgame, and finding warp skip strategies is always fun, even though it's not as difficult as slugging it through the entire map. That said, in my opinion, a map is only as hard as its easiest solution, and easy solutions are plentiful in the Birthright route. The moral of the story here is that there are universal truths across all Fire Emblem games. Having excessively high defense and avoid to the point of near invulnerability is almost always good. Anyway, thanks for watching, and if you want to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing, becoming a YouTube member, or donating to my Patreon, or even just showing up when I stream more absurd challenge runs like this. See you all in the next one. Bye.